It was the 8th of April 1886. In the House of Commons, the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, stepped forward to speak. For months now it had been public knowledge that Gladstone believed the Irish, then still firmly under the sovereignty of the British Crown, should be granted some form of self-government, otherwise known as Home Rule. Yet the details of his proposal had been kept a closely guarded secret. Months of speculation and concern in Westminster, and decades of campaigning in Ireland had been leading up to this moment. Now, at last, Gladstone was to present his plan before Parliament to be voted on. Whatever his intentions may have been, this action would upend the existing political order in the British Isles, bringing the issue of Home Rule to the forefront of British politics, over which it would loom ominously for the next 3.5 decades, tearing apart the political party which, in one form or another, had dominated Westminster for the last 50 years, and entrenching sectarian divisions in Ireland, laying the foundations of a violent conflict that would drag on for nearly a century. Before delving too far into Home Rule, it's worth taking a brief look at the system it was intended to replace. This was the Dublin Castle system, named after the castle, in Dublin, from which the Crown-appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland acted as the country's chief executive, holding the ultimate authority to execute and enforce the law. Ever since the Act of Union, passed way back in 1800, Irish laws had been made at Westminster, where the 100 or so Irish MPs were vastly outnumbered by their almost 500 British counterparts. Meanwhile in Ireland, Catholics, i.e. the majority of the Irish population, continued to be excluded from government roles by the island's dominant Protestant minority. Unsurprisingly, many Irish chafed under this arrangement. The story of Home Rule really gets going in 1867, when a transatlantic group of Irish nationalists, known as the Fenians, launched a revolt against the British Crown. The uprising itself was swiftly put down, but it's in its aftermath that we meet the first major player in the story of Irish Home Rule, that being this man, Isaac Butt. At first glance, Butt might seem like an unlikely hero of Irish nationalism. For starters, he was a Protestant from a well-to-do family, part of the elite that was stifling Catholic ambitions. He was also a Conservative, having at one time served as an MP on the Tory benches. What's more, during the 1830s and 1840s, he had actually opposed a popular movement calling for the repeal of the Act of Union, making him a Unionist. But none of this is as contradictory as it might first seem. You see, at this early stage, many of those calling for self-government saw Home Rule as a means of returning to the old Irish Parliament that had existed before 1800, which had been dominated by Protestant landowners like Isaac Butt. Butt was a patriotic Irishman, and had always defended the Act of Union in these terms. Remember, at this moment in time, membership of the Union meant that Ireland was at the heart of a global superpower. For men like Butt, that was something Irishmen could and should be proud of. That said, the Great Famine of the 1840s and early 1850s did make Butt rethink the relationship between the two islands. The effects of the famine had been made much worse by the decision of the British Whig government to end relief efforts, motivated by a belief in the laissez-faire economic doctrine, as well as a helping of ethnic prejudice. This move had disastrous consequences, and it is hard to imagine a government of Irishmen sitting in Dublin would even consider such a policy. As a result, Butt became convinced that Ireland needed some degree of self-government. This belief was only strengthened by the failed Fenian uprising of 1867, as Butt came to understand that Irishmen having greater control over their own affairs would be conducive to greater political stability. Butt wasn't just a politician, he was also a barrister, and in this capacity he defended the leaders of the failed uprising. He would go on to lead a movement to secure the release of the Fenian prisoners, and it would be off the back of this amnesty campaign that Butt would found the Home Rule Association in 1870, later renamed the Home Rule League. This new movement was initially led by landowning Protestants like Butt himself, many of whom believed Home Rule would stop British politicians from interfering with their rights as landlords. But they were not the only group to see Home Rule as a means of realising their aspirations. Take, for instance, the tenant farmers, the the chief opponents of the landlords in the many rural confrontations that occurred during this period. They saw Home Rule as an opportunity to secure for themselves more rights and protections. Then there were the Catholic middle classes, whose upwards aspirations were stifled under the current system by the island's Protestant elite. But what about the Catholic Church, who offered their support to the movement after the British government refused to give financial aid to impoverished Catholic universities? Despite all this, it's important to keep in mind here that Home Rule at this stage was still far from being a mass movement. Remember, Butt was an old school Tory. That's just not how they did things. Over the next few years, Butt's Home Rule League enjoyed impressive electoral success, and after the 1874 election boasted 60 out of the 103 Irish seats at Westminster. Home Rule was also attracting admirers amongst the British Liberal Party, such as this man, Joseph Chamberlain. That's a name you're going to want to remember for later. But all this success did come at a price. As the movement grew, it came to include more and more people with conflicting visions of Ireland's future. For example, some Home Rule MPs had defected to the League from the Liberal Party, and so pushed for a federal structure with lots of self-government, whereas others came from the Protestant Tory political tradition, and so favoured a more limited form of self-government, like what had existed before the Act of Union. Unsurprisingly then, the Home Rule MPs at Westminster lacked direction, as is demonstrated by one instance in which 45 Home Rulers voted against a land reform bill that Butt himself had introduced. The movement was also starting to attract young men impatient for success, or those with greater ambitions, Republicans, who saw Home Rule as nothing but a stepping stone on the path towards full Irish independence. But the old Conservative was losing touch with his own movement. This is where we meet the man whose surname actually makes it into the top 10 most frequently used words in this video, which tells you something. I'm talking of course about Charles Stewart Parnell, and yes, that's how I'll be pronouncing it. Parnell, like Butt, was from a family of wealthy Protestant landowners. Indeed, he was distantly, though still measurably, related to the British royal family. His family had a history of Irish nationalism, his grandfather having been one of the chief opponents of the Act of Union. As a Protestant landowner, Parnell would maintain a concern for the role of landlords and Protestants in a post-Home Rule Ireland, though he was able to balance this with a genuine sympathy for the plight of the tenant farmers. Above all else though, Parnell was a charismatic and skillful politician, adept at harnessing the energy of the militant radicals to further his own objectives, all whilst maintaining an air of parliamentary respectability. Whereas Butt had remained aloof from the elements of Irish nationalism that did not share his particular vision, Parnell used the diversity of the movement to cement his own authority, acting as an arbiter of sorts, in whom radicals, constitutionalists and clergy alike could all trust they would receive a fair hearing. In this way he was able to get all these disparate elements pulling in the same direction, which was no mean feat. In August 1877, the Fenians ousted Butt from the presidency of the Home Rule League's British-based sister organisation, voting in Parnell as his replacement. Control of the movement was starting to slip away from the old barrister, though Butt did manage to hold on to the leadership of the League itself until his death in 1879. That too would ultimately end up in Parnell's hands, confirming him as the new head of the movement. Around this time, Parnell started to meet with Fenians from both sides of the Atlantic. Out of these meetings came the New Departure, an agreement which provided the militant and constitutional elements of Irish nationalism with unity of purpose. This committed Parnell to a policy of full legislative autonomy for Ireland, as well as compulsory land purchases, that is, forcing landlords to sell their land to their tenants. In return, Parnell received financial aid from the United States. But Parnell still had to contend with the more radical parts of the movement, who became increasingly obsessed with the issue of land, as in farming and tenants' rights, rather than that which is not sea. Many of these radicals were calling for wide-scale land redistribution, fuelled by an anti-landlord sentiment that a landowner like Parnell couldn't really get behind. For Parnell, legislative independence came before the land question. Land and tenants' rights issues did need settling, but mainly to secure the position of the landlords, freeing these more educated men to lead the movement for Home Rule. It was a means to an end. But Parnell also recognised that, by championing the rights of the tenant farmers, he could inject his movement with popular energy, all whilst widening his base of support. This can be seen in the readiness with which he claimed a position of leadership during the outbreak of rural unrest known as the Irish Land War. Some background. The Great Famine had freed up lots of land that had been bought up by rich farmers, meaning land ownership was becoming concentrated in the hands of a small number of families. Irish landlords were often absent, with little interest in improving the land or even compensating tenants for making improvements of their own. Meanwhile, the tenants, particularly in the poorer west of Ireland, struggled to feed themselves. This situation was bad, and it got a lot worse in the late 1870s when crop failures, mixed with falling prices for agricultural products, left many tenant farmers, especially in the west, starving and unable to pay rents, which in turn led to evictions. In response to these poor farmers being kicked off their lands, Fenian radicals started organising meetings in County Mayo, some of which reached attendances in the tens of thousands. Sensing the potential of this popular discontent, but unwilling to let it fall under the Fenians' control, Parnell visited the region and spoke at some of these meetings, giving the unrest a nationalist character. Soon the protests had spread out from County Mayo into the rest of rural Ireland, save for Ulster. Everywhere farmers were demonstrating, resisting evictions and refusing to pay rents. It was in this context that the 1880 elections took place, with Parnell's nationalist politicians running on a platform of tenants' rights. The result was 63 seats for the Nationalists, out of a possible 103. To soothe the unrest, the newly elected Liberal government passed a Land Act. This met a lot of the farmers' demands, though failed to cover farmers who were behind on their rent payments, as well as those who held their land via a lease agreement. The Act therefore benefited farmers with larger operations, but did little for the small farmers of Western Ireland, thereby undermining Parnell's carefully constructed alliance. Accompanying this poisoned carrot was the stick of a Coercion Act, which increased the government's power to put down unrest by allowing for internment without trial. Parnell came out in opposition to both acts, and he, along with several other Irish leaders, was arrested and imprisoned. Whilst interned, they released a manifesto calling on all farmers to stop paying rents. With the unrest showing no signs of slowing down, the government were forced to come to the negotiating table. A deal was struck, in which Parnell agreed to withdraw his manifesto, allow the Land Act to be implemented without disturbance, and take a stand against agrarian crime. In exchange, the government would release him and his fellow nationalists, whilst also addressing the concerns of those rural workers who hadn't benefited in the most recent Land Act. Free once more, Parnell set about founding a new political vehicle with which to advance the cause of self-government, the Irish National League. Now the energy for Home Rule was to be channelled through something resembling a modern political party, with positive results. Over the next few years, the League would enjoy dramatic growth, with the number of branches increasing fivefold between 1884 and 1886. This new League would be run in an autocratic manner, according to Parnell's will, though many saw this as necessary given the size of the challenge facing them. Parnell's hand was further strengthened by a series of electoral reforms that enfranchised 500,000 Irishmen, many of whom were the newly politicised tenant farmers, amongst whom Parnell was very popular. These reforms meant that, outside of Ulster, the Irish electorate was now dominated by Catholics, whose support Parnell had successfully courted. As an added bonus, many Irish migrants living in Britain were also enfranchised for the first time, meaning the UK's two main parties would now have to pay greater attention to Irish concerns. In June 1885, the Liberal government resigned due to an unrelated scandal, and the Irish nationalists were called upon to support a Conservative minority government. A mere decade and a half after the founding of Put's Home Government Association, the Irish Home Rulers now held the balance of power at Westminster. So that's how things were going in Ireland, but what was the lay of the land across the Irish Sea, at the heart of British politics? First, let's look at the Liberals, who might be described as the more progressive side of the British political equation. They had governed the country from 1880 to 1885, during which time they had been led by their most notorious chief, William Gladstone. Now entering his late 70s, Gladstone was a politician driven primarily by conviction and principle, or so he would like us to believe. As his career had progressed, he developed a tendency to build his political platform around great moral crusades. On Irish matters, Gladstone and his supporters were convinced that efforts to govern Ireland without the participation of the Irish themselves were as morally wrong as they were practically infeasible. In private, Gladstone had been playing around with the idea of some sort of self-government for Ireland since the 1870s. This interest had grown over the course of 1885, to the point that, shortly before that year's general election, he went so far as to produce a draft Home Rule bill, though at no point did he publicly declare Home Rule to be a policy. Still, rumours were circulating, especially after he failed to denounce Parnell for a speech made in August of that year in which the Irish leader stated his aim of an Irish Parliament. Similar to Parnell, Gladstone presided over a diverse party in which differing and often contradictory political visions were bound together by the authority of their common leader. On the more moderate side of the party were the Whigs. Men of this faction tended to hail from the aristocracy, sons of wealthy families, you get the idea. These men tended to be sceptical about Home Rule, viewing it, much in the same way as the Irish Republicans, as nothing but a gateway to full independence. Therefore, if Home Rule was granted, it would destabilise the United Kingdom, endanger Britain's coastal defences, and threaten the religious liberty of Irish Protestants, whilst benefiting the Catholic Church. This last point wasn't just a case of religious prejudice, though there was some of that involved, but it also spoke to the central principles of their ideology. You see, the Whigs believed in a form of social evolution away from tyranny, inequality and backwardness towards liberty and progress. According to this worldview, the ancient, dogmatic, traditionalist Catholic Church was an antagonist that needed to be overcome, and any movement over which it held influence was to be treated with suspicion. The recent unrest across the Irish Sea had also sullied their opinion of the Irish nationalists. The Whigs did support some form of justice for Ireland, but only if it lay within the current constitutional framework. The law had to be supreme, and the nationalists were not to be indulged for breaking it. Nor were they too keen on Home Rule's leader. They were suspicious of the autocratic power Parnell had amassed for himself within the movement, and were staunchly opposed to his protectionist inclinations. Remember, these were the political descendants of the guys whose distaste for government intervention had caused the needless loss of Irish life during the Great Famine of the 1840s and 50s. The Whigs were led by this man, Spencer Cavendish, or Lord Hartington as the history books like to call him, though I'm going to refer to him and all the other titled men in this story by their mortal names. Cavendish and Gladstone had never quite seen eye to eye. Back when Cavendish had been a rising star in British liberalism, Gladstone had given him assignments which, to an outside observer, might appear as though they were intended to dull the younger man's advancement. But despite this, Cavendish continued to serve Gladstone loyally. He led the Liberals in opposition from 1875 to 1880 after Gladstone had decided to take a step back from active politics. Yet despite winning the 1880 election as the party's leader, Cavendish was all but forced to turn down the premiership when Gladstone returned to the scene and declared that he would serve in no government other than his own. Like most of his fellow Whigs, Cavendish was ideologically opposed to Home Rule, though his understanding of Irish affairs was coloured by personal considerations. His younger brother had been assassinated by the Irish Fenians during the last days of the Land War, an act which it is worth mentioning had been condemned by Parnell and most of the Fenian radicals, but still. On the other side of the party were the radicals, led by Joseph Chamberlain, father of this Chamberlain, as well as this less well-known Chamberlain. In stark contrast to their Whig colleagues, Chamberlain and his fellow radicals believed state intervention was required to bring about progress. Though there had been several instances of the Whigs joining with the Conservatives to block some of the more radical of the radicals' proposals, the two factions had been held together by their shared core principles: liberty, progress, etc. A point worth keeping in mind is that, for Chamberlain and his allies, the government bore the ultimate responsibility for progress, and so progress could only be achieved if the imperial executive was strong. Consequently, Chamberlain was against anything that would in any way undermine the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament. Chamberlain also had a strained relationship with Gladstone, chafing under the latter's impulsive and often dictatorial style of leadership. By 1885, he was openly discussing Gladstone's retirement, which can't have helped relations between the two men. During the Land War, Chamberlain had gone so far as to threaten resignation over the Coercion and Land Acts, arguing, much like the Irish, that the former went too far, whilst the latter didn't go far enough. For Chamberlain, land reform and local government were the solution to the Irish problem. Early in 1885, he'd proposed 2 legislative assemblies for Ireland, one in Dublin, one in Belfast, to deal with some Irish affairs, such as, for example, education, endowments, public works, that kind of thing. That same year he entered into discussions with Parnell about a central board for Ireland, which Chamberlain hoped would serve as an alternative to full-blown Home Rule. But though Chamberlain shared Gladstone's view that the Irish deserved some form of self-government, a crucial point of difference is that, whereas Gladstone could see Ireland as a nation, Chamberlain could only ever see it as a province. This would have consequences. Given Gladstone's age, it was expected the Liberal chief would retire in the next few years, at which point the party would have to find a new leader, one capable of maintaining the support of both factions. The idea that the Liberals might split in the near future was far from unthinkable. In fact, Gladstone himself was quoted as saying, "I hope the Liberal Party will sever and split, rather than sacrifice conviction and principle." Cavendish and Chamberlain were seen as the most likely successors, with each expected to steer the party in a drastically different direction to the other. On the other side of the floor sat the Conservatives, aka the Tories, the champions of tradition. Led by Robert Cecil, Conservative solutions to Irish problems focused more on investing in Irish resources, and possibly implementing a very limited democratic system of local government. Aside from Cecil, the most important Conservative in the Home Rule story would have to be this man, Lord Randolph Churchill, the father of this much more famous Churchill. At this moment in time, Lord Randolph was probably the most popular Conservative politician in the country. Churchill was another British politician with a personal stake in Irish affairs. He held strong family ties to the Ulster gentry, and so was naturally sympathetic to the concerns of the Ulster Protestants. Indeed, he was in fact the grandnephew of this man, Robert Stewart, better known as the Viscount Castlereagh. Stewart did lots of very important things in his career, but what matters here is that he had been the architect of the Act of Union, which had bound Ireland to Great Britain. It should therefore come as no surprise that Churchill was unshakable in his opposition to Home Rule and the defence of the Union. However, Churchill's was what one might describe as a progressive Unionist policy. He believed that the best way to smother Home Rule was to kill it with kindness. Ireland needed to be treated on equal terms with the rest of the UK, and if that meant introducing some degree of Irish local government, then so be it. The 1885 election was to be contested between the Conservatives and the Irish on one side against the Liberals on the other. At first glance, this might seem unusual, given that, of the two parties, the Liberals had shown the most interest in Irish self-government. But it is worth remembering that Parnell was something of a social conservative himself, and, for all their interest, the Liberals didn't seem all that near to offering anything concrete. A few months before the election, Parnell had met in secret with the Conservative Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Parnell came away from this meeting thinking the Conservatives would be amenable to some of his proposals. Meanwhile, Cecil could now draw upon Parnell's influence over the many Irish migrants living and voting in Great Britain, whilst also aware that Gladstone would now feel the urge to outbid his Tory rivals in order to win the support of the Irish party. The Liberals came out of the election with the most seats, 319 in total, 17 short of a majority. For the first time since the party's founding, not a single Liberal MP was returned from Ireland. Then came the Conservatives with 249. The Irish Nationalists were able to increase their numbers up to 86, with 85 seats in Ireland and 1 in Liverpool. You know, in England. With neither the Liberals nor the Conservatives winning an outright majority, Parnell held the balance of power, meaning his Conservative allies continued in government. Given the contrast between the Irish demands for constitutional change and the traditionalism of the Tories, it would have been fascinating to see how exactly an Irish Conservative coalition would have played out. Unfortunately, we'll never know. One day before the polls closed, quick side note, back then, British elections tended to last for several weeks. But anyway, one day before the polls closed, the existing political settlement was upended when Gladstone's son leaked to the press that his father had come around to supporting Home Rule. Though there had been rumours to this effect for a while now, the timing of this revelation caught everyone off guard. Indeed, whether Gladstone Sr. even knew about this beforehand is lost to history. Either way, Home Rule was now the Liberals' flagship policy, and it looked like it was going to be the main issue in British politics for the foreseeable future. In response, the Conservatives adopted a more unionist position, announcing their intention to introduce a new coercion bill to suppress the Irish National League. Incidentally, the Chief Secretary of Ireland who would have introduced this bill was one W.H. Smith, as in, W.H. Smith. This of course prompted the Irish Nationalists to switch their support to the Liberals, making it impossible for the Conservatives to continue in government. When the government fell, the Irish in attendance cheered and waved their hats, but their Liberal colleagues remained eerily silent. The immense task of solving the Irish question would now fall upon their shoulders, a task which many no doubt considered insurmountable. One Liberal observer wrote of the scene, "Never were the victors less triumphant, or the vanquished less depressed." Rather ominously, 18 Liberals voted with the government, Cavendish amongst them. The Queen cried when her Conservative ministers came to her with their resignations. She was utterly convinced that Gladstone's administration would be the worst ever. Cecil, for his part, was more optimistic, advising the Queen not to dissolve the Parliament just yet. He believed that the Conservatives would find themselves in a better position to go to the country once Gladstone had made his true intentions known. Returning once more to the office of Prime Minister, Gladstone invited Cavendish and several other Whigs to serve in his cabinet, but they refused, unwilling to support any form of Home Rule, irrespective of the details. Chamberlain agreed to serve, but only on the condition that he was not committed to any plan. Over the next couple of months, Gladstone worked on his proposals in secrecy, without consulting any of his esteemed colleagues. In the meantime, opposition to Gladstone was stirring within the Liberal ranks. At the heart of this nascent rebellion was one George Goschen. With the encouragement of the Queen herself, Goschen brought together a group of moderate Liberals to begin organising a grassroots Liberal campaign to oppose Home Rule. At the same time, Goschen also approached Cecil about the possibility of an electoral truce. Cecil was interested, but refused to commit himself unless there was some guarantee that their alliance would last, and that the rebels would not simply rejoin the Liberal Party once their seats were secured. Soon Goschen had coaxed Cavendish into meeting regularly with this group of moderate dissidents, though the latter refused to commit himself to any one course of action. Whereas Goschen championed an electoral pact with the Conservatives, Cavendish spoke only of a parliamentary alliance to defeat Home Rule. On the 13th of March, Gladstone finally shared his plans with the Cabinet. The most notable aspect of that which would become the first Home Rule Bill was that the Irish would be granted an assembly. The word Parliament was carefully avoided. This assembly would be made up of two orders that could meet and vote separately or together, depending on the circumstances. The first order would consist of 103 men, with 28 peers and 75 members elected by those who held land worth a net annual value of more than £25, whilst the second order would have 204 members elected by the normal electorate. Westminster would retain control over issues such as war, peace, foreign treaties and trade, as well as Irish customs revenue, whilst the Assembly's ability to interfere with religious matters was tightly restricted. The role of Lord Lieutenant was to be unchanged, retaining its control over the Royal Irish Constabulary. No special status will be granted to Ulster. The most controversial part of the bill, at least within Liberal circles, was the 24th clause, which read as follows. In and after the appointed day, Ireland shall cease to return representative peers to the House of Lords or members to the House of Commons, and the persons who, on the said day, are such representative peers and members shall cease as such to be members of the House of Lords and House of Commons respectively. Simply put, Ireland would no longer be represented in Parliament. This was problematic for many radicals, as the Irish would continue to send tax revenues to Westminster, and as we all know, taxation without representation is tyranny. Other Liberals, Chamberlain included, feared the withdrawal of Irish MPs would sever the bonds between Ireland and Great Britain, breaking up the United Kingdom and undermining the unity of the Empire. Unable to bring himself to support the bill, Chamberlain resigned from the cabinet, leaving Gladstone to take on the challenge of passing this legislation without either of his two most influential lieutenants by his side. This brings us to that scene on the 8th of April. In front of a packed House of Commons, with the Prince of Wales in attendance, Gladstone spent 4 hours outlining the details of his Home Rule Bill. In his speech, Gladstone laid out the moral arguments for Home Rule, referencing the many wrongs English governments had inflicted upon the Irish throughout history. He also suggested that rejecting the bill would play into the hands of the Fenian radicals, both in Ireland and the United States. Political solutions, Gladstone argued, should be attempted now, whilst peaceful outcomes remained on the table. The difference between giving with freedom and dignity on the one side, with acknowledgement and gratitude on the other, and giving under compulsion, giving with disgrace, giving with resentment dogging you at every step of your path. This difference is, in our eyes, fundamental, and this is the main reason not only why we have acted, but why we have acted now. This, if I understand it, is one of the golden moments of our history, one of those opportunities which may come and may go, but which rarely return, or if they return, return at long intervals, and under circumstances which no man can forecast. There have been such golden moments, even in the tragic history of Ireland. It would be fair to say that reactions to the bill were mixed. The Irish were initially cautious about the bill, as it had failed to meet some of their demands, such as the control of Irish customs revenue and the retention of the Lord Lieutenancy. On top of this, the Irish were required to make several fixed payments to the British Crown, totalling over £4 million per year, considerably more than the £1 million the Irish had previously suggested. Nevertheless, Parnell soon adopted a supportive stance, after recognising the patriotic capital to be gained in the coming political battle. Of course, not all of Ireland had been advocating for Home Rule in the first place. In the eyes of the Irish Unionists, the bill would relegate them to the status of colonials, making Ireland in essence a vassal of Great Britain. Many Irish Liberals were also wary of any measure that would give too much power to Parnell, as his economic protectionism clashed with the revered liberal doctrine of free trade. Opposition was fiercest in the Protestant north, where the prospect of armed resistance to Home Rule was talked of openly. Here, Protestants who lacked the social and financial privilege of men like Charles Stewart Parnell and Isaac Butt feared that a legislature for the whole island would be dominated by Southern Catholics, leaving them vulnerable to discrimination. Such anxieties met with a lot of sympathy across the water, especially from men like Randolph Churchill. A few months earlier, Churchill had visited Belfast, where he'd been received like a king, being welcomed by a Unionist demonstration featuring as many as 70,000 Ulster men and women. Whilst there, he'd made a speech in which he'd called the Unionists of Ulster to action, assuring the crowd that they had no lack of influential friends in England, whilst offering the grim prediction that, should the question of Home Rule linger, the struggle would likely spread beyond the realm of constitutional politics and into that of violence. This speech had inspired great enthusiasm amongst the Ulster Unionists, and sectarian tensions had festered over the following months. Parnell and the Liberal government had been furious at Churchill for his actions, but Cecil and his fellow Conservatives had come to his defence. Since then, Churchill had emerged as one of the leaders of the Conservative campaign against Home Rule. One of his top priorities had been to secure Chamberlain for the Unionist cause. Though a Conservative, Churchill possessed something of Chamberlain's radical energy, and the two men built up a good rapport, dining together frequently and keeping up an almost daily correspondence. Chamberlain's history of confrontational radicalism had put him at odds with the Whigs, to say nothing of the Conservatives, and so this relationship with Churchill was vital in allowing Chamberlain and his allies to exist within the budding Unionist alliance. The focal point for Westminster opposition to Home Rule was Cavendish and his Whigs. With many anticipating the defeat of the bill, followed by Gladstone's resignation, Cavendish was seen as the best bet for the next Prime Minister. In the contest over who would lead the Liberal opposition, Cavendish enjoyed 3 advantages over Chamberlain. Coming as he did from the party's more moderate wing, Cavendish would find cooperation with the Conservatives much easier. As previously mentioned, Liberal moderates and Conservatives had on several occasions come together in the Commons to defeat radical proposals. Cavendish also enjoyed the financial support of the Liberals' wealthy donors, with whom he shared not only a political outlook but intimate social connections. Remember, Cavendish was and is better known as Lord Hartington. Chamberlain was and is just Chamberlain. Finally, as a radical who championed democracy and had a history of supporting Irish self-government, Chamberlain needed to present some alternative to Gladstone's proposals, ultimately suggesting a federalised system modelled on the constitutional arrangements of Canada. As it so happens, this was the same example Isaac Butt had used to illustrate his vision all the way back in 1870. Remember Butt? This scheme would have preserved the supremacy of the Imperial Parliament. However, it was unacceptable to Whigs and Conservatives alike, who could dismiss Chamberlain's compromises without elaboration. But Cavendish would begin his campaign by scoring something of a known goal. On the 14th of April, he appeared at a joint public meeting with the Conservatives at Her Majesty's Opera House. The atmosphere was intense, with the mere mention of Gladstone's name eliciting boos from the audience. This made Cavendish visibly uncomfortable. The Whig leader's presence at this meeting was seen as a mistake by Liberals of all stripes. A few days later, he was deselected by his local Liberal association, and many Liberals that were sympathetic to his position now avoided openly expressing their opposition to Gladstone, for fear of meeting the same fate. But Cavendish had learnt his lesson. From now on, he would distance himself from the Conservatives, seeking to organise a more exclusively Liberal opposition to Home Rule. Cavendish's Liberal Association were far from alone in their support of the PM, as Liberal associations up and down the country appeared to be sticking with Gladstone. Like all the other Liberal MPs who were thinking of voting against the bill, Chamberlain had to secure the support of his own Liberal association in Birmingham, who were commonly referred to as the 2000. I should mention here that Birmingham was very much Chamberlain's city. He had previously served as the city's mayor and enjoyed immense popularity amongst its inhabitants. Almost all the Birmingham MPs were his allies. At a meeting of the 2000, Chamberlain announced that his opposition to Gladstone was conditional, and that he was willing to support the bill if his objections were addressed. At this moment in time, the general consensus was that the present division would only be temporary. Reunification was expected once the matter of Home Rule had been settled, and so in public at least, Chamberlain adopted a conciliatory stance, repeatedly stating that he was prepared to get behind Home Rule so long as the 24th clause was withdrawn and the Irish MPs remained at Westminster. The 2000 held a vote of confidence in Chamberlain, which the Birmingham Radical won with an overwhelming majority. Then came the vote on Home Rule. The Gladstonian officials overseeing the meeting wanted to delay the vote, as they believed that once it became apparent that every other Liberal association in the country was with Gladstone, the Birmingham Liberals would feel obliged to follow the party line. But Chamberlain was having none of this. He demanded an immediate vote, and the 2000 agreed, carrying a resolution that endorsed their champion's position. Though no doubt buoyed by this local success, Chamberlain would have been disheartened to learn that the National Liberal Federation, or NLF, had announced its unconditional support for Gladstone and the government. The NLF was a union of all the Liberal associations in England and Wales, through which the party's rank and file could make their opinions known. Chamberlain had been the driving force behind its founding, and ever since the NLF's views had tended to lean radical. Yet when push came to shove, the NLF sided with Gladstone, abandoning their founder and spiritual leader. That had to have stung. Estranged from the party leadership, unwilling to work with the Whigs or Conservatives, and now having lost his influence over the rank and file, Chamberlain and his allies were looking increasingly isolated. But for a brief moment it looked as though there might be a way back. Through correspondence with the well-meaning intermediary, Chamberlain got it into his head that Gladstone was about to give way on the retention of Irish MPs. Unfortunately, Chamberlain seems to have overestimated the extent of the concession, writing to his ally, I am assured that there is a complete surrender to me. So when Gladstone announced that the retention would be limited to votes on Irish taxation and imperial matters, Chamberlain felt deceived. Soon after, he started attending meetings with Cavendish, his longtime rival, and together they began to plot against the man who had served as the bridge between their respective camps. No doubt sensing the odds weren't in his favour, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to divide his opponents, Gladstone called a meeting of Liberal MPs. There he announced that the coming vote would now be solely on the principle of an Irish legislature for Irish affairs. After the Commons had signalled its approval, he promised to withdraw the bill, with the intention of putting forward a modified bill later in the year, in which the troublesome 24th clause would be remodelled. The Whigs' objections to Home Rule went beyond a single clause, so this was easy to dismiss. But for many radicals, this concession would allow them to avoid rebelling against the party while staying true to their beliefs. Chamberlain was worried. Accepting such a concession would give Gladstone the victory, dividing the Liberal Unionists in the process. It would also give Gladstone more time to press home his advantage in the local Liberal associations. After Gladstone's declaration, several Unionist radicals stated that they were now satisfied with what the Prime Minister was offering. Chamberlain immediately called a meeting of his own, but only a few showed up. The radical leader now had three options. He could go back to Gladstone with his tail between his legs, abstain and allow Cavendish to become the face of the rebellion, or vote with the Conservatives against the majority of the radical faction. He chose the last option. With that decided, Chamberlain needed to persuade his supporters to follow suit by not merely abstaining but actually voting against the bill, against Gladstone, against the bulk of the Liberal Party. This would be no mean feat, considering most of these men were not against the principle of Irish self-government. They, like Chamberlain himself, simply had issues with some of the details in Gladstone's bill. Furthermore, if the government were defeated on this issue, it would mean another general election, in which the Conservatives might win a majority. Surely they favoured a Liberal government with whom they disagreed on a single issue, to a Tory government with whom they disagreed on several. Chamberlain met with some of these wavering Liberals. When called upon to speak, he suggested his real wish was to abstain, though he would follow whatever course of action the group decided upon collectively. He then read a letter from a colleague, a veteran radical not in attendance. In this letter, the absent radical assured Chamberlain that, whilst he personally could not bring himself to do anything but vote against the bill, he would support anyone who decided to abstain, so that the country would be spared another general election. Moved by this display, the Liberals in attendance voted almost unanimously in favour of opposing the bill. This would prove a decisive turning point. When it came time for the crucial Commons vote, the bill was defeated by 341 to 311. The result was announced to great cheers from the Unionists. 93 Liberals ended up voting against their own government, around 29% of the parliamentary party. Of those Liberals who could be described as radicals, around 30 to 40 voted against Home Rule, meaning that, though the overwhelming majority of that faction stuck with Gladstone, enough had defected to ensure the bill's defeat. Seeing Chamberlain shortly after the vote, Parnell is said to have remarked, "There goes the man who killed the Home Rule Bill." The government dissolved. The country at large would now have its say on the matter. The general election of 1886 was one contested in bad blood, filled with instances of rioting and politicians on both sides being pelted with stones and rotten fruit. Yet for all the mischief going on in Great Britain, across the Irish Sea in Belfast the situation reached a new level of unpleasantness. On the day the bill was defeated, Protestant celebrations devolved into a series of street battles with the police that would drag on for 6 days, followed by 2 more flare-ups over the following month or so. In all, between 30 and 50 people lost their lives in the rioting, with hundreds more injured. Outside the halls of power, the biggest supporters of Home Rule, save for Irish migrants, tended to be found in mining communities and amongst the urban working class. You see, for many English people, Home Rule wasn't just about Ireland, but also a vague spirit of reform. Gladstone himself enjoyed great popularity amongst these sections of the population, who associated him with things like disestablishment, temperance, and reforms in education, taxation, and labour. As a result, Gladstone's Liberals did especially well in areas like Yorkshire, the North East, and Wales. The Welsh were particularly supportive of Home Rule, and not just the urban working classes. Like in Ireland, the Welsh countryside was mostly worked by tenant farmers who held similar grievances to their Irish counterparts, and were therefore pleased to see Gladstone pursuing policies that sought to address said grievances. The prospect of Home Rule for Wales was also starting to be talked of with enthusiasm by Welsh nationalists. Shortly before the election began, Parnell had visited Cardiff, where he'd been received by cheering crowds. By contrast, when Chamberlain visited the city a week later, he was forced to walk the streets with a police bodyguard protecting him from the fury of the city's inhabitants. The Liberals also won most of the seats in Scotland, though 1886 did see the lowest return of Liberal MPs from the country in over 50 years. The party did especially well in the east of the country. Indeed, our old friend George Goshen lost his Edinburgh seat in what was considered something of an upset. The bastion of Unionist support was to be found in northern Ulster and rural England, especially southern rural England. Turnout was low across the country, to Gladstone's detriment. Partly this was due to the high number of uncontested races, as the Gladstonians didn't have the time or the funds to run candidates against all the incumbent Liberal Unionist MPs. Many Liberal voters stayed away from the polls because they weren't sure about Home Rule. Some felt that Gladstone had allowed himself to get distracted by Irish affairs, at the expense of social reform. The final result was an overwhelming majority for the Unionist alliance, with 393 seats and 51.4% of the vote, killing any chance that the Commons would pass a Home Rule bill. Of these, 77 were Liberal Unionists. Gladstone's Liberals won 192 seats, with the Irish Nationalists winning 85. This result meant that the Unionist alliance was now free to pursue an island policy without the need to compromise with Parnell or the Gladstonians. But what form exactly the new government would take was not initially clear. No one party enjoyed a majority in the Commons, and so it was time for the negotiations to commence. The Liberal Unionists may appear to have held the balance of power, but they themselves were divided. Chamberlain and his followers had organised themselves into the National Radical Union, separate from Cavendish's Liberal Unionist Committee. These Radical Unionists were firmly against joining a government led by the Conservatives. The men around Cavendish, less so. Cecil offered to support Cavendish as the leader of a coalition government, but the latter declined, having come to appreciate how such a move would damage his Liberal reputation. Churchill was rewarded for his efforts with the position of Chancellor, and set to work on some local government reform for Ireland in order to appease Chamberlain and his Radical Unionists, with whom he continued to enjoy a good relationship. However, this would all come to nothing when, just a few months after the election, Churchill unexpectedly resigned over an unrelated political gambit, never to return to top-flight politics. This left Chamberlain more isolated than ever. In time, he would be forced to overcome his reservations and join Cavendish's Liberal Unionist Committee. But if you're thinking this might spell the end of Chamberlain's time as a leading political presence, that he might now fade into obscurity, marginalised by his new moderate and conservative colleagues, well, let me tell you, nothing could be further from the truth, though that is a story for another time. The lasting partnership between the Conservatives and Liberal Unionists was confirmed when a re-elected Goshen was made Chancellor, a post he would hold for the next 5.5 years. Though the coalition may have been uneasy at first, over time the two parties would move closer together, until a formal merger in 1912. This rightward shift was aided by some of the radicals who had opposed Home Rule returning to Gladstone in the years that followed. In all, 13 Liberal Unionist MPs would cross back, most of them radicals. Though out of office, Gladstone had much to be pleased about. For one thing, his personal prestige in Ireland and the rest of the Celtic fringe was at an all-time high. But even more encouraging was the fact that, since most of the defections had come from the Whigs, the party was now dominated by radicals. The Liberals had become a more ideologically cohesive political unit, something that would stand them in good stead when fighting the battles to come. Over in Ireland, the Home Rule crisis had awoken the forces of Protestant unionism, which would remain on guard against any future attempts by British governments to subject them to the authority of the island's Catholic majority. In the conflicts of the 20th century, both the Republican Nationalists and the Loyalist Unionists would be able to find roots in the Home Rule crisis, with the Home Rulers evolving into the former and their opponents the latter. 1886 marked the high point of Parnell's career. He now had one of the UK's two main political parties backing his cause, whilst he himself presided over a movement that spanned almost the entire nation, encompassing tenant farmers, landowners, urban workers, middle-class professionals, and the Catholic Church. But it wasn't to last. In the second half of 1886, crop failures would create an agricultural depression, which encouraged the Irish radicals to return to agitation. This created a problem for Parnell, as he was forced to stay aloof from the campaign despite its nationwide popularity for fear of putting British voters off Home Rule. He would hold on to his position until being brought down by a sex scandal in 1890. But the cause of Home Rule would go on without him, eventually blossoming into a struggle for a fully independent republic. But that really is a story for another time.